Welcome back, viewers, and thank you for staying with us. We are in the month of October, and in addition to the carnival hype, we know that globally, October month means something. And if you weren't aware before, well, you are at the right place because October has been designated for quite some time as Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And just in case you have been behind in terms of all that's going on, I just want to share some information with you coming from the World Health Organization. And of course, this year's theme is no one should face breast cancer alone. Breast cancer is the most common cancer globally with around 2.3 million new cases every year. It represents 1 in 8 cancer cases in both sexes and a quarter of all cancers in women, with a 70% mortality occurring in resource-constrained settings. Health system barriers and patient-level factors with low levels of awareness and knowledge are contributing to low uptake and of early detection services, with resultant late-stage diagnosis and poor outcomes. In many resource-constrained settings, breast cancer affects a relatively younger population, significantly contributing to premature mortality and maternal orphans. And this is from the World Health Organization's global website. And of course, a lot of information is there. Over the years, we have heard people come forward, share their experiences, their stories, lessons learned. And I am sure that many of you know someone who has been diagnosed with breast cancer, and maybe even yourself had that experience. And I just want to put this plug in here. Yes, men can also get breast cancer. According to the US, their data, it's 1 in about 1,000 men do get breast cancer. So it's something that is not impossible, though rare. But of course, a lot of the focus is on our women, and we continue this morning to recognize Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and just for you, our viewers, to be more informed. And it's my pleasure to welcome to Tobago Updates this morning Mrs. Nicole Dyer-Griffith, no stranger to Trinidad and Tobago. She represented us in 1999 as Miss Universe Trinidad and Tobago. She's an entrepreneur. She's a philanthropist. She has become an activist for breast cancer as well, and the list can go on. So let's welcome her this morning as she joins us. Good morning, Nicole.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
All right. And of course, many of us are quite aware of your recent diagnosis of breast cancer, and you have been very vocal. You have been very brave in sharing your experience with us and taking us along that journey thus far. And just in case some of our viewers have not been up to speed on social media and just clueless, yes, Nicole has shared her diagnosis with the world. She was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. And if you can just share with us, part of that journey, because as I said, you have been sharing for quite some time in terms of this experience. And I just want to start off on when you got that. And before we get to the diagnosis, what would have prompted you? Because I know you shared you already had your medical for the year. What would have prompted you to just go back and say, let me check again?
Gary and my mother, because I am one of those persons who I do not drink alcohol. I do not smoke cigarettes. I do my checkups as I should, my mammograms, my palpitation tests. I do what you're supposed to do. I do not place myself, my body in any situation that would be considered high risk, or that, when you look at all of the parameters surrounding any form of cancer or any form of lifestyle type illness, there are certain parameters that, you check and say, okay, this puts you high risk, that puts you high risk. I do not put myself in any of those things, but here I am with stage 3 breast cancer. So it was quite shocking because there are no indicators. One of the indicators they look at is gene and genealogy, and they test to see if you have the BRCA gene, BRCA1 or 2. I do not have any of those genes either. I have no family history of breast cancer. Of course, there are family members who would have experienced cancer, but different types of cancer, not breast cancer. So this was certainly quite shocking.
Definitely.
And the reason why I went and did another medical for this year, so that was 2 medicals this year, is because Gary noticing changes and my mother, and the 2 of them literally teaming up and said, you need to go and do another check. Something is not right. Something you just to make sure, just to appease us, the two of us, just go and check again. And so I went and did another medical and did a mammogram. And this time with the mammogram, I did an ultrasound, and it is the ultrasound that identified the masses.
And I just
so
want
one
us
of the
to
things,
pause right there, Nicole, before we continue, because I think that is so important. Because when you hear about breast cancer and detection, we are all as women told when you reach at least 40, but now they're advising women to start earlier, do a mammogram. And it seems that that is they wear it all, mammogram. But here you are saying that your mammogram would not have shown the breast cancer, but an ultrasound. So based on that,
but
what you,
mammogram came up as dense, so that
right,
you would not have been able to see it with the naked eye.
right,
And so the doctor said, let's do an ultrasound to see what happened. And then, in speaking with many women, many women have told me that they too presented mammograms that presented as dense or with dense tissue, or you couldn't see anything properly. And so it ended there. So one of the lessons coming out of this is ensure if you do undertake a mammogram, if it presents as dense, you have dense tissue, or it's occluded, you cannot see clearly, go and get an ultrasound. And it is the ultrasound that will be able to identify any of the masses. Because as I mentioned to you, I do the palpitation. So up to this day, you cannot palpitate and feel any mass or masses. You
right.
can't. So to just leave it to that and say, well, if you feel a lump, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. In my case, you don't. Up to now, you don't. So that it is the ultrasound that really underscored and you were able to identify what you could not see on the mammogram.
Right. And it's so important for those of viewers who are joining us this morning to do your follow-ups as well and not take your body for granted. Sometimes, there are signs, not maybe obvious ones, but we often can detect if we're paying attention. I just don't feel like myself. Don't ignore it, but, talk to your doctor. And I'm also quite aware that there are many of us who may not have regular checkups for various reasons. We usually go to the doctor when we get sick, when we have a cold, and we don't really do maintenance of our body. So that's so important. And I can't begin to imagine, Nicole, your thought process in terms of getting the diagnosis. As you mentioned, you didn't have any of the symptoms, you're not in that risk factor bracket, but here you are told you have breast cancer. What's your thought process like then?
What's the next step? That is, my son tends to jokingly say that you're very robotic, but to me, it's not being robotic. It's simply about planning and understanding that this is the situation and creating everything within a framework. So for me, when the diagnosis was confirmed, immediately I'm thinking, okay, so this is it. Now that I know what it is we're treating with, what is the plan moving forward? And how can we quickly begin to operationalize this plan? That's where my headspace immediately went into, operationalizing the plan and getting to the point where I'm over this and I'm finished with it. And this is why I termed it an invasive inconvenience, because that's what it does. It takes 1 to 2 years of your life in managing this scenario. And so it's quite inconvenient, especially if you have a lifestyle like mine where, you're working on 15 different things at the same time. Very inconvenient. So I frame this as a project to be managed, and it is about identifying and lining up what are the steps to manage it and get to the end point.
And do you think your response to that diagnosis is because of your background, your experience being an entrepreneur, just being that person who knows how to get things done?
Well, I have walked through numerous fires in my life, numerous fires. So I tend to say that if another fire, I don't get burnt. I just, it might hurt a bit, but I will come through it because I've come through so many. This is just another one of those things that I need to manage and move on. So that in this process, sometimes you look at things occur and you wonder why? There was a point where I was going into the why. This doesn't make any sense. Why me? And then I had to pull and say, well, why not you? You're so special that this, there are many other people. Why not you? And so therefore, when I had that self-talk and I said, okay, this is the situation, then what are the lessons coming out of this situation? Because there are so many things that you can either go a number of directions. You can either go into the direction of woe is me, and, just have it consume you, or you can go into the direction of what are the lessons to be learned coming out of this? Because
Right.
there's so many different parameters that can be touched. There's so many different people that can be reached. There's so many different ideologies that can be conceived out of this. There must be a reason why you were chosen to carry this burden. And so the reframing it in that perspective, it allows me now to look and try and identify what are the reasons, because there are few key things that came out of it. One was reframing it as an invasive inconvenience. When you begin to think about that way, it changes the paradigm of how you choose to manage it. And two, manage and move on. One of the, you mentioned earlier on in your introduction of me, is that I am an advocate. I do not consider myself an advocate for any form of cancer.
Right.
It happened, it occurred, I'm managing, and I spoke about it. And in so doing, a number, well, let me tell you, girl, I have been, there's so hundreds, if not thousands of people have reached out to me, either to share their own experiences,
Right.
either to speak of their, that they're afraid and they're not sure how to approach it, either to speak of their own treatment regimes, so many different things. So all of this now is just adding to the aspect and the question that I asked: what are the learnings from this? So
Right.
that's where
And you may not describe yourself as an advocate, but you have become one, as you said. You mentioned that providing that support, because when people, and I will describe you as a person of influence, go through these trials and are able to share, people listen. You have that listening population there. You are able to reach people sometimes that even maybe health officers cannot reach. So it is important that you continue to share and provide that support even as you are supported. Now, I would have also mentioned at the beginning of the show that the World Health Organization, the theme for their breast cancer awareness campaign is "No one should face breast cancer alone." Now you have this diagnosis and you have to communicate it to loved ones. And I know you seem to be very pragmatic. You know what you have to do and you work towards it. What is it like having to face your son, your husband, your mother, those who were pushing you and say, hey, if you're not feeling well or something is wrong, let's do this medical again. And now you have to communicate it.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Gary and Mummy were there from the onset. So they were right there when the diagnosis was confirmed. So I didn't have to share it with them. They were there from the get-go. The most challenging experience I have had thus far, and I've had many challenging experiences throughout this process, including the surgery for the port and so on. But the most challenging was telling my son, the kid, because the first time, I think, how am I going to share this and make it sound less intense? How am I going to share this and, make it and not have to say the word cancer? Because from the time you say the word cancer, immediately people think the end point and they think about death and dying and all of that. So I'm thinking, how do I reframe this so that it doesn't impact him as negatively? And the first time I did it, I said to him, I have something I want to share with you. It's just a little issue that I have to manage, but don't worry, I'll manage it and all is well. But I just wanted to let you know. And the first thing that he said is not cancer. I said, no, it's not that. Don't worry about it.
He read the play.
And then I went
Yes.
back. And then I went back and I told Mommy and Gary, because, everybody was on, tenterhooks.
Yes.
How's she going to talk to the boy about this? And I told them I couldn't say it. I couldn't. And they said, you need to go back and tell him the truth.
Right.
You need to be honest. Tell him the truth. And so I reframed. I had to steel myself, because, they will be looking at every single reaction, looking at your eyes, looking at your face, looking at everything and feeding off of that. So I had to craft how. And I took him out to a corner of the house that I consider a nice, relaxing corner.
Right.
And we had about 2 hours of conversation of all forms of nonsense, from cars to you name it, all sorts of things. And I just slipped it in there and said, I really enjoy having these conversations. And so. And he looked at me, he looked away. And the look on that face is a look I will never want to see again. It was a look that could just rip you apart. And I had to really hold back. I think I mentioned to somebody, I think at that point I did shed a tear, because that look, that was tough. But after, we just continued the conversation. We continued talking about the management plan. And from that day, he has not seen me in any weakened or diminished mode. He's just seen me managing and moving on. And so for that, everybody's comfortable because they're seeing that that's what we're doing. As a team, this is what we need to do. This is how we're going to do it. We manage and we move on.
Mm-hmm. And what made you decide to bring the rest of us in on what's going on?
Well, this is managing any form of cancer, particularly stage 3 or stage 4. Those are the more advanced forms.
Yes.
You have to prepare yourself and those around you for any eventuality. And one of the eventualities that I had to face is because of the type that I, was diagnosed with. One, and this mine is multifocal, which means it wasn't a lump. It's widely spread, and it also spread to the axial lymph nodes, so that it is more intense type of treatment that would be required. And one of those treatment regimes included 8 rounds of chemotherapy. So I had to steel myself to manage the chemotherapy as well as the others around to expect certain things. So it's almost an education process that you have to undertake. Okay, expect A, B, D, and E. Thank the Lord above that I have been able to manage the process rather seamlessly. And so for everyone around, it was a lot easier for all of them. So that sharing with a team, from the time that I received the diagnosis, 2 weeks into that, my mother called together a team of prayer warriors.
Right,
and
of course.
And that team was called Team NDG, and it started a prayer circle, and it's going and going and going. And in terms of the decision to do the public sharing, it was something that I was, going back and forth and discussing with Gary and Mommy. Should I not? Should I not? And then when my hair follicles decided, look, I've had enough of this, we're gone.
Right.
I said, okay, so I'm bald. I joke with everybody. I'm like a hairless cyborg because there's no hair. And I said, something, one of the lessons, remember I mentioned earlier on, there are a number of lessons along the way.
Yes.
And one of those lessons is that I have shared most of my life from since I was about 14 years old with Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
Because from the time I was 14, I was modeling stages all across the region with mannequins. And the country really has seen my trajectory. And this is another significant milestone. I am not going to hide. I'm not going to wear wigs. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to share it with everybody, and so that we all along this journey together. If you want to be a part of the trajectory, you're more than welcome to. And as I share, I will give you updates. And so I crafted. I love production. Everything in my life is a production. And so my dear friends, Stephen Dubal and Richard Young, we did the production with the video, and we released the video. And I have to tell you, honestly, I was overwhelmed by the response, overwhelmed. And not only in Trinidad and Tobago or the Caribbean, across the world, I've had people reach out to me from Croatia, from the most, far-reaching countries that you would never imagine that this would have reached. And it really was quite overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming.
And just on a side note, you do wear the bald very beautifully. And I think it's so important, even in sharing, because we tend to go through these things alone when we get, as we would say, bad news, and we tend to be very private, and you don't want people to come in. But I think one of the good things about sharing is that people are there to support you and hold you accountable in your journey. So of course, I really want to thank you for being here this morning. And viewers, we are going for a quick break, and when we return, we continue our conversation with Nicole this morning, and it's all about managing breast cancer. Morning, Tobago. Welcome back, viewers, and if you are now joining us, we are having a conversation with Mrs. Nicole Dyer-Griffith on her experience of being diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. And of course, it is October month, which has been observed for the last several years as Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So again, thank you, Nicole, for sharing with us this morning. And as we continue to talk about your experience, I just want to say a special good morning to Mrs. Laureen Edu and Mrs. Rhea Richardson George. And we know these two women have been very bold and brave in their fight with breast cancer as well. And they would have shared at their time with their diagnosis and the stages they had to go through. And they were very, very bold to share and just tell us as it is. And in sharing, remember, you can strengthen someone. I know it's not always easy, but you have to make that decision, what you want to share, how much you are willing to share. But just keep in mind that when you do share, you strengthen someone, you encourage someone, and you also educate, because there are some of us out here, we hear about these terms all the time, and we still don't know enough about it and what we are supposed to be doing in terms of maintaining and checking our bodies to ensure that if we do have any of these types of illnesses, early detection is so important. So, Nicole, I want to go back to our conversation. And, in your journey thus far, and you mentioned in terms of lessons being learned, is there any one or two things that may have popped out that you realize that in this whole journey, there are things people say about breast cancer. There may be myths out there that people are not aware of, but because now you are having that first-hand experience, you are able to share some of the things you may have discovered that you said, oh, this isn't really true. I've heard this, but this is not so. Nicole, I think your mic is turned off. Sorry.
Are you
Yes, we can hear you now.
right? So one of the immediate things that jumps out is to do not depend on a mammogram alone. If it is the mammogram comes back as reading dense tissue, or it is too difficult to read, ensure that you follow up with an ultrasound. If the
Right.
mammogram is easy to read and is perfectly clear, and so that's fine. But if there's otherwise, and even the smallest indicator of it being unable to be read clearly, get an ultrasound. The
Right.
second thing is that you do not wait until you're 40 years old to start doing mammograms. That is over and done with. You need to start doing the assessment processes earlier than that. Maybe I would say around 30. I've seen some readings identifying 20, 25 years old, but you hear the stories of when you reach 40 years old, you have to start doing it every year and so on. No, you need to start earlier than that to
Right.
ensure, because we're seeing an upsurge of younger women in their 20s, 25, etc., with breast cancer. So let's not wait until you reach the age of 40 or so. Start earlier. The third part about it is that there is a palpable gap in terms of primary level um, intervention, healthcare. In healthcare, there are three levels of intervention:
Right.
primary, secondary, and tertiary. And so, primary level intervention treats with awareness and education, and so that you nip things in the bud before you have to arrive at secondary, which is immediate treatment, and so on, tertiary, where the person is hospitalized. So that I have noticed that there is a palpable gap in terms of education and awareness, to make it a little bit more wide reaching. And the reason
Right.
why I'm saying this is because, one, I asked after this diagnosis, I just started asking random women, when was the last time you had a mammogram? And
Right.
I asked 10 random women. Out of that 10 random women, 4 of them asked, what is a mammogram?
Wow.
That is insane.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've also identified with, so I dug a little deeper as to these 4 women. These 4 women were women who had two of them were single parent households. 3 of them had to identify ways of which they have to sustain themselves and their children. So when you have this type of scenario, and you have women in particular who have to look at paying rent,
Yes.
food, school books, this, that, a mammogram is the last thing on their minds. You
Definitely.
understand what I'm
Yeah,
saying? So therefore,
definitely.
it looks at how do we treat with filling this gap. One, the gap in education, and really drilling down to reach the smaller communities where people may not necessarily have these things on their mind. And two, how do we mitigate the cost factor involved? Because treating with cancer is extremely expensive.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, I wrote a book. I'm finished with my book. I'm just doing the formatting and so on. One of the things I identified in it is wondering if the cost of treatment of cancer is not prohibitive, and wondering why is it so prohibitive, and is it almost elitist in that only certain people who can afford to do things to treat certain elements of cancer can do it, whereas others have to try and figure out what is the next step. I have met people who've had to mortgage their homes, who've had to
Yes.
sell
Yeah.
cars in order to be able to do the basic treatment of identifying chemo and managing chemo, and so the cost of cancer is just absolutely ridiculously prohibitive.
Right. And you see people, as you rightfully said, making all these sacrifices. So whether someone is holding a benefit concert for someone, whether they're selling food, and it's really, for me, when you think of you have to do that on top of dealing with everything else, it can become
It's
so stressful.
And you made an absolutely correct point, because in my conversations and looking to see, because of course, when it was identified, okay, this is the trajectory that you have to do: chemo, surgery, this, that. And so I'm looking at, okay, you do it this type hospital, you do that hospital, you do it here, you do it there. And my main stressor was the cost of this thing. The cancer and all of those things were the main stressor,
Yeah.
was financing this and
Yeah.
trying to figure out, okay, how can I do this? Can I afford this? Can I not afford that? Can I do this? Can I do that? That was stressing me out the most. And so when you think about it from a global perspective, and you really, there are so many questions to be asked.
Yeah.
One of which I spoke about, the gap in terms of the primary level intervention to the secondary to the tertiary. The other
Right.
is the issue of cost and managing the treatment of cancer.
And even when you look at the public healthcare system, I know sometimes we are very critical of it, but they can only do so much. But even sometimes in terms of how the system is set up, because I remember last year I got a referral to do a mammogram. So in Tobago, of course, you have the public sector is the go-to because it's very limited in terms of what's available privately. And as you said, even the cost involved. And when I went to the hospital to get an appointment, I was told that no appointments are available. And that was last year. And she called, she said until 2024. And I'm like, we're talking about 6 months into. So are you giving me a date for 2024? And she said, no, I can't give you a date because we're not sure what's happening then, but we will call. And I waited and I waited. And then I told my husband, I can't wait anymore. I'll take a trip, go to Trinidad and see about this because, I've heard so many stories of people waiting on the public system. And then by the time they do get an appointment, when time for intervention, the diagnosis, the stage is so late that sometimes not much can be done. So, while they were waiting, and in Tobago, there's also this challenge in after you do any type of testing, in some cases, you have to then wait for results for whatever reason. So even, by the time you get your results, you need to know what's going on because so much time has passed. And that's one of the challenges we face.
Absolutely. I worked as a registered nurse in Tobago for a year. So I am very familiar with the processes across there. But it's the same thing over here.
Yeah.
And it's not only cancer, but if it is, we're looking specifically at cancer. When you get, for example, so you get diagnosed, or you want to get a biopsy, or you want to get something to identify and confirm what is taking place, and you're at a specific stage. When they tell you 6 months down the line, that is when you can get an appointment. You arrive at another stage. It is
Yes.
given the cancerous cells the opportunity to spread and to think. And so those are some of the challenges. I read last week actually about the issue of some persons having to wait. The chemotherapy drugs were not
Right.
readily available in the country. You cannot stop your chemo treatments because that regime is so serious that once it starts to work, you have to keep on doing it in order for it to be effective. And so when you have these challenges to face, these are people's lives that we're dealing with.
Yes.
It is a matter of life and death in many of these situations. And so when you look at it from a whole system perspective, there are many, many gaps that need to be filled. It's a very, very challenging scenario, having to manage it. And then on top of that, manage it yourself. And then on top of that, having to manage all of the
Exactly.
extenuating circumstances to treat with it.
And of course, we do recognize our hardworking doctors and nurses from the oncology unit and those who provide support for those who are going through their cancer treatment. We know that sometimes you too are stressed by the system because you want to do more. the reality is only so much can be done sometimes, but I always believe when we examine systems, there's always room for improvement and we can do things better. Because as you said, Nicole, it's a matter of, literally, it's a matter of life and death. You mentioned as well education, and it's very alarming to know that it depends on who you are or where you are in society, that information comes to you a particular way. And your random survey you did of those 10 women, the 4 who had no clue. I mean, I've been hearing about mammograms since I'm a teen, so it's in my mind at a certain age. It's just something that I know I have to get done. But here we have some women, and not just women, but people, because I want to include our men in this conversation, because it's very important. They are the ones who have to stand by their wives, by girlfriends, mothers, aunts, grandmothers, who may be diagnosed with cancer, or just even as you had your support system, your husband, your mother, telling you, go on, and for the men in the lives of these women, just to encourage us as well. Have you done a mammogram? Have you done whatever screening you need to do, and vice versa? That men also need to be educated. What else? Or should I say, where do we really start? Because I was going to ask what else, but we realize in some cases there's no what else. Nothing has been done, right? So how can we really get that education out to the groups that have been neglected or just overlooked, or for whatever reason have not been able to be a part of the conversations taking place? Because again, if you don't hear about breast cancer any other time, you hear about it in October, but we're still missing so many people.
Yeah. That is something I was contemplating myself, because when I did that random survey, I was absolutely shocked that there are women who have no clue. But then I said, Nicole, why are you shocked?
Right.
Because if people's main focus is to provide food for their children,
Right.
then as a parent, you are thinking about your children. You're not thinking
Yeah.
about yourself. And you're certainly not going to take the little $350 or $400 that you could buy food or buy books or buy whatever to go and do something that you do not understand. Why is that important? So
Right.
that when it is, we have to look at how do we drill down the public education system. There are numerous NGOs, CBOs, etc. Are we reaching all of them so that they can reach the populations that may not necessarily have access to television or to the newspapers or to the social media platforms? Are we utilizing social media platforms effectively enough? Are we reaching the populations that are not ordinarily reached by traditional means of media? Are we utilizing all forms of media? So there are a number of questions that need to be asked. Are we infusing all of the NGOs? Are we, so for example, an NGO in Point Fortin, or NGOs in Point Fortin, are we reaching those NGOs to reach the people in the communities? Are we
Right.
reaching NGOs in Charlottesville, for example? And are
Right.
they going out in their communities to reach people? So that it has to be a whole system approach of public health and education awareness that we have to. So one of the things that you universally preach is that when you invest more in primary health care
Oh, yes.
and education, research, and stuff, you do not have to spend as much in tertiary
Most
healthcare, because when you
definitely.
provide the education, the information, and so from this perspective, immediately it diminishes how much you have to do in secondary and tertiary. It's just common sense, really. And so we really have to, when I say we, I suppose as a society, but I suppose there are systems in place from a governmental perspective that really is supposed to be charged with responsibility of so doing. However, we can't sit and wait on that,
Right.
because it's only that much. And if it is, there are still palpable gaps. Then, as responsible persons, we have to try and do what we can to be able to fill those gaps.
And I like I like your language you use. You say we, because many times we wait on the government, as you rightfully said, to solve our issues. But we have to, even if it's we the people, speaking louder and ensuring the government is held accountable, we have to get involved. We have to do something and not just wait. And our NGOs and CBO, there are many NGOs and CBUs in Trinidad and Tobago, and sometimes one wonders what are they really doing? Yes, they may have their focus, and sometimes you see these letters coming to various private sector desks asking for money, doing this, they want, but what are they really doing? Education is so important, whether they are advocating for children, whether it's for cancer, whether it's for, NCDs, whatever it is, you have to really have a strong education program because you want to effect change. And as we know, we say knowledge is power. So if the knowledge is not there, then you are not empowering me to make that change. Again, I'm going back to the group of us, or the group of our citizens who may be left out of all these education programs that may be existing. How do you really reach them? And I think that's the question that the NGOs have to ask, the government has to ask. And because they are so wrapped up in their lives and trying just to survive one moment, even if they pass a poster, pick up the newspaper, it's not going to speak to them. And many of us have the attitude, oh, that's not going to happen to me. I'm fine. It's not in my family. I mean, even look at your diagnosis, you're not in the risk factor, of all the things that could happen to you health-wise. I'm sure you didn't think about breast cancer because you're not in that group. But these women, these men who are living their daily lives and just, focus on getting by, they are not going to look at the flyer that talks about breast cancer. They are on social media looking at other things. They're not going to listen to the video Nicole just posted about her experience. How do we really get them to pay attention and say, hey, this is your life. Yes, you may not be able to go to one of the private health institutions, but let's still utilize what we have available in the public sector. It's better than having nothing at all.
Well, one of the things, I believe in the ripple effect, and the ripple effect speaks to just one drop, and that one drop can begin to widen the radius of influence. And my out certain widen that the radius of influence, because that is how I was able to reach some of those women, of
Right.
10 women, who really had no clue about mammograms or could care less about mammograms, didn't see the importance of doing that, because as far as they were concerned, they are too busy trying to live from paycheck to paycheck or from dollar to dollar. And it is because they saw this and they saw me coming out and saying it. One, the visuals and the aesthetics shocked them because,
Yes.
I mean, what? Nicole, bald and so
Yes.
on. And two, the mere fact that we communicated and they were able to just reach out and via text or whatever. And we had conversations. And so sometimes things you may overlook may actually have more impact than anything else. So that my coming out and speaking and sharing and really just not being afraid or ashamed or closed up to share certain bits of information and to take people along the journey. And I think the continuity along the journey, people feel invested and involved.
Yes.
And because there is a level of investment and they want to know, well, what next? What are you doing? How are you feeling? And so this is why I suppose it has opened the floodgates for so many. And when I tell you, girls, so many, I'm around hundreds,
Right.
thousands. If you look at my TikTok account, it's just thousands. One video is like 70 something thousand with 3,000 comments and so on. Sometimes a viewer can't respond to everything and everybody.
Of course.
But sometimes I just think a lady yesterday, I had a few moments and I was going through one of my Facebook pages and I saw a lady reach out to ask me if I could speak with her relative because the relative is so very depressed and they're not
Right.
treating with diagnosed and they're not treating with it. And if I could just call and talk. And I said, okay, it's not going to hurt.
Right.
Taking up 2 minutes of my day, if I could
Yeah.
find it, it's not going to hurt me to do that. So one of the things, and I see a lot more people coming forward. I see a lot more bald heads being posted. I see
Yes.
a lot of people sharing experiences. And as much, sometimes we tend to downplay when people of influence share, but many
Right.
people tend to look, okay, let me see what you're doing, whatever. And so sometimes it has an impact. And I have seen the impact of my sharing the video and sharing the trajectory and so on. And it has worked because that way I was able to reach those women who had no
Right.
clue about mammograms.
Right.
And so that's part of my ripple effect. If I could impact just one person and see how I can really positively influence them to take more responsibility for themselves and, just do a little bit more for them, for their health, then I would have done my part. And if 10 of us were to take that responsibility to positively impact one person, then that would be 10 multiplied by that. And
Yes.
so that is the ripple effect I'm talking about. We can't save everybody. We can't change things because there are certain things that are outside of our element of control and our locus of control. For example, the really global impact programs to increase primary healthcare, to increase education and awareness, to find ways to integrate all NGOs and CBOs so that their impact can be felt more. Some of those things are outside our locus of control, but what is within our locus of control is being able to positively impact one person, maybe
Right.
5 people, and
Yep.
getting those 5 people to do the same. And so if we do that, then our time on this earth would have been worth something.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that person of influence has to have a world stage, because you're in a church group, you
No,
live in a community, you work
exactly.
somewhere, and just sharing in
Exactly.
those spaces, will definitely go a very long way. And I want us to
Let me,
speak.
if I
Yes.
can just share
Sure.
something. I love afternoon teas. That when I spent some time in Sunderland with my son, he went to
Right.
Sunderland on a football scholarship, and so we lived there for a little while. And I just was so consumed by the afternoon tea type scenario. So when I came back to Trinidad and Tobago, I introduced something called Afternoon Tea with Nikki D. And so I'll invite different groups of people at my home, and so to have conversations, to share experiences. And so a spin-off from what I do with the O2N Foundation,
Yes.
where we create, connect, and cohere. And so, people really look forward to these afternoon teas. And I hosted an afternoon tea recently to commemorate completing the 8 rounds of chemo, because that is one of the paradigm shifts that I'm doing. I firmly believe that after each round of chemo, you put your body through such intensity that at the end of it, I need to ring my own bell. I need to
Yes.
celebrate that I've
Yes.
done this. So that immediately shifts the paradigm of thinking, and the brain thinks, okay, let's go to the next round because there's something waiting for me positive at the end of that. So I'm thinking, it's almost like Pavlov with the dog. The dog, every time he rings the bell, the dog gets a treat.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
almost like shifting a paradigm of thinking. After every round of chemo, I do something positive to recognize you've done this. And so after the 8th round, I hosted an afternoon tea. And at that afternoon tea, there were two musicians. One of them who's very well known in Trinidad and Tobago, but I will allow him to share his own story,
Yes.
and another young pianist. And they came, someone brought them there as a gift to me to play music and stuff. Well, I wouldn't say, because you will immediately know if I call the type of music, but and so
Right.
they played. And after, I just opened it up because I felt, people need to share, and open it up. And these two men shared their stories. One of them, he managed cancer and everything cancer had to throw at him. And he was a popular figure in Trinidad and Tobago, and he disappeared, and we didn't hear about him
Right.
for many years. And when he shared the types of trials and tribulations that he went through with this, oh my God, I said, and you're still standing here and playing this beautiful music. And so, and you need to tell this, to other people. You need to share to other people. And the other young pianist, he shared his story. His girlfriend passed away. She was diagnosed at 23 with stage 4 cancer,
Wow.
stage 4 breast cancer. And she one of the things that, and he cried whilst this was 9 years ago. And in sharing his story, he started to weep. And so, it's still fresh, because he said one of the first things that when she was diagnosed, she called him and told him that she was going to kill herself and that she couldn't handle it and she didn't know what to do. And for her, it's a death sentence, and
Yes.
she just wanted to die. And he said this was midnight, and he lived in San Fernando, and she was in a park somewhere, and he just ran from where he
Right.
was to try and meet her, stop her from killing her. I mean, when you hear these
Yes.
impactful tales from men, I beg them, because there were some journalists, and please, these are stories that people need to hear, so that when you hear this and you hear the supporter of the person, or you hear a male person experiencing this and really giving of themselves, you are not alone in sharing, in experiencing what you're experiencing. You are not alone if you get diagnosed and you feel like this is the end of the world. I can't
Yeah.
do it anymore. I can't manage it. I can't handle it. You're not alone, because someone would have experienced that previously, and hearing that experience and hearing how it was managed And for me, more impactfully, hearing it from men who were open and honest and just,
Yes.
share, it was something really quite special. So the important thing is for people listening is that you're not alone. And one of the things I tell people, tell the nurses and doctors and radiologists and everybody managing persons managing cancer, is that unless you have experienced this yourself, then you really don't understand.
Quite
So
true.
therefore, take extra time to listen when your patients or clients are complaining about a chemo port, or complaining about, the hair loss and stuff like that. It's not a normal experience,
No,
to have one
definitely. Yeah,
and
and
just
it's
feel your
just,
hair falling
it's
out in your
gone.
hand and so on like that. It's
Yeah.
not a normal experience at all. It's not a normal experience, having the effects of chemotherapy or radiotherapy, or having to hear that you have to do 2 surgeries, 3 surgeries, having to hear you have to have a mastectomy. It's a part of your body being removed from your body.
Yes,
That
yeah.
is not a normal experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to share with persons, managing persons who are treating with these things, remember, unless you have actually felt it yourself, just turn up the levels of empathy, turn
Yes.
up the levels of compassion, turn up the levels of understanding for the person experiencing it as well as for their families, because this is not normal. They are treating with, am I going to have this person next week, next month, next year, so
Yeah.
turn up the empathy.
Yep. And it's easy sometimes for us to make things trivial, but we have to remember as women, certain things define us as being a woman. So when somebody loses their hair and somebody may say, but you're still alive, what happened? Your hair will grow back. That's how we are sometimes as a people. And you have to do the mastectomy, and people say, you're okay, you don't need it, and we hear all these things. And I'm remembering Ria would have shared her story with us here in Tobago a few times, and I know one of the experience she would always share when she got the diagnosis, or when she was told she had to do XYZ. She said she bawled because she just had to let it out. She was, of course, so mixed emotions, and I want to tell our viewers, we all handle things differently. And what Ria said, after she cried, whether it was for days, she composed herself and she got ready to fight this thing. But her initial reaction too was like, why me? How this is me, and that kind of thing. So it's very important. And I say, let the process run, but you have to make up your mind to get up and fight this thing, because even doctors tell you the science of it sometimes is in your mind. So if you give up even before you fight, sometimes the war is over quite quickly. But if you stand your ground and you decide, yes, I am going to give this my best shot, you'll be around. It's not a death sentence. Yes, so many changes happen, but it doesn't have to be a death sentence. And it's so interesting that you shared the story about men, because the question I was going to ask you is about, what role our men have to play in this breast cancer awareness and managing breast cancer when the women in their lives are diagnosed with breast cancer.
It is one of support. As I mentioned, Gary was the first person to notice, you need to go and do another. Yes, you did a medical before. Yes, you do one, but go back. So it is extremely important. And throughout this entire process, he has been completely involved, completely engaged, and in the management of, one of the things I said before is that they have seen me being very calm, managing and moving on. And so how I respond influences how everyone around me
Right.
responds. And we've all been very supportive because we've been doing this and working together as a team. And so it's important, but it's also important for us to recognize that you are the protagonist, in that this is happening to you and you are managing this. But once you are surrounded by people, then it is also impacting on them. And so whilst you are managing this, sometimes it's helpful to ask, how are you doing? How is this going? And so to
Right.
remember the people around you who this is also impacting, because cancer, whilst it targets an individual, it also targets everyone around that individual. Because once something is negatively impacting you, it's also impacting them. And sometimes we tend to forget the people around us. Sometimes we tend to forget that they would have to accompany you to the hospital back and forth, back and
Yes.
forth. They have to take time off. They have to see you going through this. And seeing someone, being debilitated or having to really fight impacts someone who cares about you.
Of
And so
course.
it's good to remember them and not only focus on how they have to continue to support, but also how you support each other and how you work together as a team to manage this process moving forward.
And I just want to thank you again, Nicole, for sharing. And I go back to my word I'm using. You have become an advocate. You did not put it up on yourselves, but definitely, you sharing have really brought this thing again into focus for some of us who would have just, let it pass by again. And it's very inspiring to see you be so brave and be so brave and share. I remember looking at your video when you said, this was your last round of chemo and you showed us the area where the port would go in and that sort of thing. And it's so inspiring. And one thing I would have learned from you, because even though I try to keep, and that's why I say education is so important, because we still miss things. When I listened to one of your videos and when you shared the mammogram had the report that it said it was dense and you need to do an ultrasound. And I'm like, okay, I thought this was just the end of it, even though it says that, because, and I'm encouraging people to share. So I would share now, because when I did my mammogram, part of the results said I needed to do an ultrasound. And I didn't take it on because for me, okay, the mammogram is okay. The radiologist and I did not say, okay, this is something you need to follow up on. I was just given the report and said, well, you should do it. And when I heard you, I'm like, okay, I have to just do what I'm supposed to do. This is serious. And it's just that, sometimes we just take these things for granted. So I can personally tell you, thank you for sharing your story, because I've never heard that before. I've never heard that being shared in even someone else's experience, but I heard it loud and clear when you shared. And therefore it has empowered me to go ahead and do that next step to ensure that I understand and know what's going on with my body. And I'll just allow you again to maybe encourage that viewer who may have had a diagnosis. It may not even be breast cancer, but some other illness, and they are struggling with coming to terms with it. And so I just allow you to share, some more words of encouragement, because you have been quite encouraging thus far.
Well, thank you. It's so very kind of you. I think what you said is encouragement enough. You've made my day by stating that you're going to do your ultrasound because you understand how important it actually is. And that sometimes, 99% of the time is the thing that really identifies that you need to move forward with it. So you've made my day by demonstrating that sharing makes an impact. And I want to thank you so very much for so doing.
All right, so viewers, we come to the end of this conversation here, but it's not the end of the conversation about breast cancer, the impact it has on us as families, as individuals, even as a country of Trinidad and Tobago. So continue to have these discussions, understand, put yourself out there to learn. Don't just wait for the information to come to you. And remember, we are in this thing together. And as the World Health Organization has selected for their theme for their breast cancer awareness program, no one should face breast cancer alone. Nicole, thank you again.
Pleasure. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Gosh,
all right, viewers. So it is.
I was saying, have a happy carnival.
Yes. Thank you. So viewers, we have come to the end of another edition of GMT, and it is Friday. I always encourage us to stay safe, be aware of your surroundings. If you see something, say something. And yes, we are in carnival mode on the island for the next couple of days. There are many things happening. We just had 2 days of World Food Day celebration in Scarborough. We're going to Blue Food on Sunday, and the many other activities planned on the island. We will have a lot of visitors coming in during this time. So please be safe and let's look out for each other. Thank you for viewing GMT this morning. I am your host, Natalie Richordson. So until the next time we meet again.